How about now? Is that a little better? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the life and cruel death of cruel death of Pennsylvania Station. A little more? Up? How about now? Everybody can hear me? Okay, let's give it a shot. So you may be wondering why Grand Central Station is up on the screen. The reason it is up on the screen is because, of this building. This is the station that was torn down. And people protested it, and landmark preservation laws were developed in New York City that prevented, this building from being torn down. However, they had to tear down the other building to make it work. So we're going to talk about Penn Station. I don't know, has anybody been at the original Penn Station by any chance? Raise hands. Oh, not too bad. I did this presentation at Wake Robin. There were about 100 people there, and probably 3/4 had been through that station. So it was kind of neat. So in October of 1963, the demolition of Penn Station began. And you can see it here. They've got staging up. They're going to start taking it down. There were protesters. Not a lot, but there were protesters fighting the demolition, trying to save the station. Irving Felt, president of Madison Square Garden Corporation, who defended the destruction of Penn Station, said, 50 years from now, when it's time for our new center to be torn down, there'll be a new group of architects who will protest to save it. I think not. It should have been taken down the day it was built. But that's my opinion. So how did we get here? While the Pennsylvania Railroad stamped its world-famous Keystone Herald on much of the East, from St. Louis and Chicago to Jersey City in the 1900s, it lacked one attribute that could only and was characterized as embarrassing. The railroad stopped at Jersey City. They did not make it to New York City. The Pennsylvania Railroad station at Exchange Street in Jersey City marked the end of the line for passengers heading to New York City. A mile of open water, the Hudson River, separated the Pennsylvania Railroad from New York City. Alexander Cassatt, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, found these ferry rides a galling reminder that, unlike its nemesis, the New York Central Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad still had no way to bring its trains into the commercial heart of the nation's largest city. Passengers traveling to New York City came to the West Street and North River piers, which you can see right here. West Street crossings to the various railroad ferries are so dangerous and so extremely disagreeable that it is a wonder they have not long ago been bridged. The street is densely crowded with teams. Police at crossings cannot keep them clear, and the great crowds who use the ferries morning and evening pass through with real danger to life and limb. The street is also one of the dirtiest in New York City, which is the equivalent to saying that is one of the dirtiest streets in the world. Manhattan's bustling, traffic-choked West Street added to the discomfort and inconvenience that attended the Pennsylvania Railroad passengers' progress into New York City. It had to have its passenger arrive no better than crates and packages of goods it delivered. So here you come into New York City, greatest city in the world, and when you arrive, this is what you see. So the Pennsylvania Railroad, which considered itself the railroad, obviously was embarrassed. The Pennsylvania prided itself on being the nation's largest, richest, and best operated railroad. The standard railroad of America had to do something. Alexander Cassatt, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, wanted a truly monumental station and to bring its passengers into New York City. He hired the architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White, and Charles McKim was the lead architect on the project. They were probably one of the best-known architects at the time in the country. They had did Boston Public Library, they had done the second Madison Square Garden, they had built Vanderbilt mansions, all the famous wealthy people mansions in Rhode Island. In fact, they did 2 buildings in Vermont. They did Burlington City Hall, and they did Ira Allen Chapel, just to give you a reference, but they were well known. In 1901, Cassatt attended the opening ceremonies of the Gare des Oreilles railroad station in Paris, but it was not the station that Cassatt wanted to see. The station was an extension of the Orleans Railroad. It was the first electrified terminal in the world, and into it ran trains powered solely by electricity. They came through tunnels running under the Seine River and under the streets of Paris. Tunnels massively walled against the river. Here, Cassatt saw a means by which the Hudson River could be conquered. Charles McKim, who had traveled in Europe, had also seen railroad stations. This one is in Franklin, Germany, with its great skylit train shed. Cassatt and McKim had worked together along with Daniel Burnham, architect for the Union Station in Washington, D.C. The station had to be located off the mall, and Charles McKim had done a lot of the planning for Union Station. This made him the obvious selection as the architect for the new station being planned in New York as part of what would be called the New York Extension. Along with Charles McKim, Cassatt hired a board of engineers: Alfred Nobel, Charles Jacobs, Alexander Chan, Samuel Ray, who would play an important role, George Gibbs, and Charles Raymond. Their task was how to get across the Hudson and the East Rivers. There were 2 main schemes. The North River Bridge. It was inspired by the Brooklyn Bridge. It was twice the span, and in 1890, it would have cost up to $100 million. And that's the scheme that you see below here. Another scheme was, again, to cross the Hudson and then come down into the station. Again, because of expense, it wasn't considered. The second scheme would require electric motive power on heavy-duty multi-car trains. Cassatt saw these engines when he went to the Gare des Oreilles station in Paris. They used electrically powered trains to enter the historic city center in underground tunnels. The solution became apparent, and over the next 16 months, Cassatt and Ray plotted the Pennsylvania's entrance into Manhattan and set the railroad on a capital program of unprecedented scale. Cassatt announced the plan for the Pennsylvania Tunnel Extension and Terminal Project, as it was officially called, in December of 1901, and put Ray in charge. And here's a view that they would bore under the city, under the river, and come into the station. Proposals for station sites were scattered across lower Manhattan. None of the proposals anticipated the final selected station site. 8 acres bounded by 7th and 8th Avenues and 31 and 33rd Streets, including a track yard that extended to 10th Avenue. The entire site will be 28 acres in New York City that they would need. Though the critics disparaged the site as somewhat marginal, it seemed close to ideal at the time. It was adjacent to the bustling Herald and Greeley squares, which, following the arrival of R.H. Macy and Company in 1901, was taking shape as the new shopping district of Manhattan. And this is the new Macy building that had just been built there. Luckily for the company, it found a neighborhood that was already condemned in the public's eyes. Famous home of vice and blackmail was how the New York Herald described the Tenderloin in 1903. Foul Tenderloin, least wholesome spot in town where vice and greed full many a men brought down. Its nightclubs, bars, and brothels brought the wrath of the reformers. The area was also home to New York's rapidly growing black population. One local realtor summed up the situation for Ray. 7th Avenue has been many years considered to be like a Chinese wall on the west side of the city, south of 42nd Street, and on beyond which no responsible man or woman would safely go is known to be filled with thugs, bums, and wicked Negroes. Marked by vice, by race, and by class, the Tenderloin was deemed expendable. Basically, urban renewal, clean it all out. But this is where the station was going. Tunnels will be installed under the North River and the East River, and they would be kept to a minimum, just enough clearance to get a passenger car through. With a selected site, the route was determined. It would start at the Harrison Interchange and continue through Manhattan to Sunnyside Yards to Port Morris and connecting with the New Haven. So originally, the Pennsylvania came in, it would stop here, you'd get on a ferry, come down here, and then you could go to New York, then you could take the Long Island Railroad up to get into the borough of Manhattan. The site they selected was right here. So from New York, you'd come in under a tunnel starting here, dropping down, going under the river at the station, then drop down again, go under the river, and then you could go over to New England. So you were connected to the east and the west. Here's an aerial view of Manhattan, and this gives you an idea. Originally, it came in here, you crossed the ferry, and you were here. The new station was up here. You'd come in, you're under tunnels, under the river, you'd come up to the station, leave the station, you go back under tunnels, under the river, and over to New England. And then this is just to give you an idea of, so here's the tunnel over in New Jersey, and then you can see where grade is. Here's the river, and the station sits right here. So the tunnels would go down, get under the river, and then back up. And then leaving to go towards New England, here's the station. Again, they would drop and then go back up. But this created a problem because because a train can only climb so fast, the geographical constraints that determined the low level of the track trains had a relatively short distance at which to climb from a depth of 93 feet at the low point of the Hudson River Tunnel to 11th Avenue, where the tracks had to level off. The net effect, once engineers determined the maximum grade tolerable for heavy traffic and fast-moving multi-car trains, was that the tracks at Pennsylvania Station had to be depressed unusually far below street level, 45 feet, about twice the depth of the subway. Basically, the trains couldn't climb fast enough to get up to grade, so the tracks were basically 45 feet below street grade. So here's a floor plan of the station. If you were going to the station, you'd come in, there were shops on both sides, you go down a set of grand stairs to the waiting room. But you really didn't wait there. It was more you got your tickets. Because at that time, they had separate men's and women's waiting areas. And then once you got your ticket, you waited for the announcement of the trains, you would go down to the concourse. So you're going down a set of stairs, you come in, and then you go down another set of stairs to get to the train. You basically had to drop 45 feet. You could come off 33rd Street or 34th Street, but again, you're going down a set of grand stairs to get you down to that level. As a passenger, you would come out, climb the stairs, and then basically reverse to get out of the station. And then here's a diagram of that arcade with the shops. Once you entered the station, there were stores on each side. And then here was the waiting room. You could get your tickets along these walls. Again, grand staircases coming down to get you at least somewhat down to the level you needed to be. And then here was the concourse. And then you take these stairs down to the trains. There were about 500 buildings that were demolished in 1903, and in the end, 5,000 to 6,000 people were forced to move. The buildings in the terminal zone were occupied by many Negroes, saloons, dance halls, gambling joints, and for many other purposes, which made the work of those who did the buy-in not only difficult, but also often dangerous. The agents offered working-class owners irresistible buyouts in cash, a payment of $5,000 on the spot with the balance in cash on delivery of the deed within 30 days. And just a view of that area. So it was fairly densely populated. House wreckers paid the Pennsylvania Railroad a fee entitling them to salvage of building material. Construction began for the new tunnels, and at the same time, buildings were being demolished for the new station. Here we're looking at Bergen Hill tunnels in New Jersey during construction, December 8th, 1905. And through all these photos, no cranes, no backhoes, no bulldozers, all by hand. And having to keep water out as you dig in the tunnels. So these are the portals, and we'll see pictures after. You'll see trains going down into portals, and this is one of them. And then here are, they called them sand hogs, digging in the tunnels. So what they would do when they got to the rock face in the tunnels, they basically would build a ring, they'd open a door and start digging. And they would basically dig a depth of the ring, put a ring inside, it would be expanded and pushed, open the door, dig some more out, push the ring, and basically became a series of rings to keep it safe. And they did it at 3 levels. Again, all by hand. And then you can see it, that this thing would be screwed down as they got more and more dirt out of the way. And here's some sand hogs. This is during construction of the Hudson River, November 1st, 1905. And let me go back one. Whoops. The shield was essentially a steel sleeve in which the tunnel was constructed. Diggers used hydraulic jacks, pushed the shield forward, allowing the slit of the riverbed to ooze through a window in the shield. As the shield advanced, rings of cast iron were bolted together inside, and with each new ring, the tunnel was resurveyed. Adjustments were made to ensure that when the two ends of the tunnels met midway beneath the river, they were aligned. The measure of this success is impressive. The Hudson tunnels deviated by only 3/4 of an inch in grade and 1/4 of an inch in horizontal alignment. This has always amazed me. When they build tunnels, they don't go one way. They go and meet in the middle, which to me is like, what if you have a bad day, you know? But they did it, and it was done using survey equipment and transit, and I mean, it's amazing. No GPS, nothing. And this is a view, you can see the rings that they kept adding, and there's the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. So this is on the Manhattan side of the tunnels, and this started January 11th, 1907. And here we're showing the portals and the framing of the arches. It's all going to be encased with brick and concrete. And this is April 18th, 1907. So the Manhattan side of the tunnels were a little more challenging because you had buildings above you. And when you're building the station, you had buildings all around you. So you can see a lot of earth, you can see staging, you can see the portals being readied. And then they built these giant air shafts to bring air down into the tunnels so the workers could breathe. So here's a bunch of people, they're just watching the station because now they've torn down the buildings, they're getting ready to build. And they're prepping the existing buildings, they're bracing them and all that because they're going to be wiping out everything because, again, they had to depress that bed 45 feet for the trains. And, you know, here's staging to keep people from going over the hole. It looks pretty primitive compared to nowadays. So they had stripped the site. So this is the area for the station. And they kept one building, which was a local bar. But pretty impressive in New York City, even at that time, to go in and just wipe all this out. And so they're depressing the area around. You know, the buildings had to remain. And they're pressing the air so they can get the tracks to come in. And, I mean, to me, this is just phenomenal. You know, here they're using this to get up to this level. The tracks are coming at this level, but the station needs to be at street level. You know, there's an overhead trolley line here that they had to maintain. There are pipes that they had to maintain. They had to keep bracing so the buildings wouldn't collapse. You know, here you go. How'd you like to be riding that and looking down and seeing, you know, and then you can see water lines, sewer lines, and all this steel and framing to support everything, and piles of brick to be laid and cars to be filled. They had some derricks, but basically it was hand work. And then again, another view supporting the road. Starting to frame up concrete walls, some derricks to help move stuff, but July 8th, 1907. To the people living in the buildings, this must have been fascinating. And again, this is when they were finished. The tracks are all laid. And here's this big vertical wall, and here are the buildings that were there, but that 45 feet down from the street. And of course, everybody was watching, you know. Pretty amazing when you think about it. And then they started framing up the station, they had poured the foundations, And even from the outside, it looks like it's a masonry building because it's all granite and stone. It's really a steel frame building, and the granite and the marble and all that is just a veneer. It's all fake. So they started framing the station November 5th of 1907. And then this is the view of the waiting room that you saw, where you could go get your tickets and everything. So that's all the steel framing for that. The contractor was required to build a mock-up of all the marble and everything, how they would look. So it got approved first before they started cutting all the marble to put on the building. So you can see the steel frame. Now the marble's going up. So it's just a cladding. It's just a veneer. And this stuff is still down here. They're still working on getting the tracks in, but you can see water lines, sewer lines, the streets being supported. And here's another view. All the columns have been installed, and they're working on the top, and they'll continue. And then this is the back of the concourse. And then the board of directors for the Pennsylvania Railroad would come by and inspect, see how it was going, if work was proceeding properly. And this is down at track level in the station. Columns, the floors being installed for the concourse level before you take the stairs down. And then the concourse. Concourse, which was filled with skylights. There's the steel frame for all the skylights. There's the marble on the walls inside. And, you know, this is the floor level at this point. And I believe these are all slabs of marble that are going to be installed. So, even though this looks like marble, it's really plaster. So you can see they had a framework, and there were plastic forms that were made to form the coffers, and they were all hung off a steel framing system. And you can see staging here that was put up, but that's all plaster. From here down, this is all marble, but that coffered ceiling is all plaster. And then the workers who carved the marble pieces right on site, and you can see how many there were. And this is just to give you an idea of scale. Here's a person. Here's that piece of marble that was carved. And that piece of marble was this piece right here. And then at each entrance, the sculptor Adolf Wiemens had 4 entablatures, and each one had a clock, because there were 4 entrances, one on each side of the building. The maiden with the garland of sunflowers represented day, and her sister with downcast eyes represents the night. And then here's a picture of them installed above the entrance with a clock. And this happened on all 4 sides of the building. So the station was completed on November 27th, 1910, after 9 years of construction. The station officially opened, and more than 100 sightseers and 25 passengers would move through the station that day. At the platform level, there were 21 tracks serving 11 platforms, and the stations could accommodate up to 144 trains per hour. An estimated 4 miles of storage tracks in and around the station could store up to 386 passenger cars alone. The station contained 25 elevators for baggage and passenger use. I'm trying to give you the size of the enormity of this project. At the start of operations, there were 1,000 trains scheduled every weekday. Of these, 600 were the Long Island Railroad trains, while the other 400 were Pennsylvania Railroad trains. The commuting times of the Long Island Railroad riders was cut up to a half hour. The station was so popular among riders that the Pennsylvania soon added 54 additional trains to its daily schedule. The station occupied 2 city blocks from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue and from 31st to 33rd Street. The original Pennsylvania Station building had frontage of 788 feet along the side streets and 432 feet along the main avenues. It covered an area of 8 acres. Over 3 million cubic yards of dirt had been excavated during construction. The original structure was made up of 490,000 cubic feet of pink granite, 60,000 cubic feet of interior stone, 27,000 short tons of steel, 48,000 short tons of brick, and 30,000 light bulbs. At the time of the station completion, New York Times called it the largest building in the world ever built at that time. The station also had 83,000 square feet of skylights and 17 million brick. So now we're going to take a trip as if we were going to Penn Station. We're going to start in Jersey, where you would change to electric trains. You would go down to the tunnels. Remember that view where the tracks were sort of underwater and everything? Well, you would go under into the tunnels. And here, yeah, here's that view before and now. This is what it looks like. And then here's the station here. So you would be coming from across there, go underneath, stay underneath, and come up here. And then again, you can see the tracks, and then they go under. And then here's another view of the station right here with all the tracks. And now you would arrive in New York City instead of arriving along with the goods and everything else. And then this is just another view of the station, just to orient you. So here's the main entrance of the station. One would go through here. The shops are located here. This is the waiting room, and then on the other side is the concourse. And then taxis would come, and that taxi area is right back here. Let me go back one more. Here's where all the taxis would line up. And so that overpass, that bridge that you see in the photo is right there. Whoops. There's that bridge, and here's all the taxis waiting to pick up passengers. And this is just to give you an idea of scale. So now we go in the station, and these are the shops. Lots of skylight, lots of natural light, right? Because these little light bulbs aren't going to do it. So here's a candy store, very highly detailed. Here's a drugstore. Lunch, you could get lunch at the station. You could get a formal dinner at the station. And here's the waiting room. So you came from the shops, which were over here. You went down a set of grand stairs. You could get your ticket, and then you would go down another set of stairs to go onto the concourse. And then there's a statue of Alexander Cassatt, who was the guy as president of the Pennsylvania Station who started all of this. So there's the shops, there's that grand stair. Again, you're dropping down. Here's another view of the waiting area. Here's people getting tickets. Here's the ticket people. And then this is the concourse, all skylit. So it's almost like you're outside. And then these would be the gates that take you down the stairs to go to all the trains. But very bright, very airy. And this gives you a really good idea. So you go through the gate, you would go down a set of stairs to the trains. Not dark, not, like a subway or anything. And then here's another view. Here's the men's waiting room. And here's the ladies' waiting room. You could even get a haircut. Of course, back then, they didn't have microphone or speakers or anything. The station agent would call out the trains by yelling their numbers out and saying, train 45 on track 12, ready to leave. And then these are the porters. They would take your ticket, and then you'd go down the stairs to get to your train. In this case, it's the Broadway Limited. Here's people waiting in line, ready to leave. I mean, it was quite an event. It was traveling. It was a process. Here's another view of that area. And then here are the electric trains. There's the engineer, the conductor. And this is another level down. This is the Long Island Railroad. The first level you just saw was the Pennsylvania. So what the architect did, he put glass block in the floor to bring all that natural light down so you don't feel like you're in a basement or in a tunnel. It's very well lit. And you can see there's all that glass block in the floor. And it was always busy. And you see people getting off, ready to leave from their train. And when they took down the station, basically from the concourse level down, everything stayed. From there up, everything came down. So you see this wonderful stair. They kept it. You can see it right here. They just took everything away from above. So what happened is that the Pennsylvania Railroad couldn't maintain the station anymore. So what they did is they optioned their rights in the 1950s. At this time, significant grime covered the exterior and interior of the station. The plans called for demolition of the station. The tracks and platform would remain, and in its place, an office building and sports complex, Madison Square Garden, would be constructed, which was this. And in exchange for their air rights, the Pennsylvania Railroad got a brand new air-conditioned, smaller station, completely below street level at no cost, and they also got 25% stake in the new Madison Square Garden. Sounded like a good deal. So this was that former dining room. This was what it was like just before demolition. So the contractors have been hired. They're ready to take it down. People are watching. So they've already started demolition. The stair is gone. The map's gone. Marble's being taken off. And at the same time as they're demolishing the station, they're building the structure for Madison Square Garden. So you can see it's all been stripped off. Skylights have been removed, just the frame is there. And it's going away slowly. They're building a new floor. This was the original arch back into where the stores were, and you would come down a set of stairs down to there. So they're framing basically the level of Madison Square Garden. And they did this all while the trains were working and passengers were taken. I mean, OSHA today would have you got a crane up here, you got steel overhanging, and there people are going to trains and working away. But you could see how grimy and sooty, you could see that the railroad wasn't taking care of the building. Before, when it first opened, it was bright, airy, and while it's still getting some light in, it wasn't the same. And again, this was the set of stairs that came down to the waiting room. Everything's being stripped away. Again, you can see steel columns have been installed. And then they've taken off that front piece. This is where the waiting room was. This piece here is where the stores were. And now not much left of the concourse. And now they're going to take the eagles off. Most of these got saved. Not all of them, but most of them. Here they are stacked on the ground. So some were given, some were bought. 2 stayed at Madison Square Garden. They're there today by the entrance. This is on a bridge somewhere in the Midwest. This is in Kansas City. It was given to the Kansas City Boy Scouts. So this was one that had the clock above the entrances. Here's an eagle. This is in Brooklyn. This is at a museum. This is one of the ladies, the one at night. Then the rest was just tossed in the Meadowlands. And of course, going by it is the Pennsylvania Railroad. Again, the round columns, just dumped as landfill. So we got this wonderful station that didn't cost anything, was air conditioned, and is such a joy to be in. I mean, it looks like a mall. You're underground, there's no natural light. And so, do I have one more? Okay, sorry. So Vincent Scully, who was an architectural historian, once the station came down, said, "Once we entered the city like a god. Now one scuttles in like a rat." But the demolition of Penn Station allowed Grand Central to be saved, because what happened was the demolition prompted tremendous public and editorial outcry on a scale never before seen. Thus began the historic preservation movement in New York City. Although in 1963 the city had no authority to intervene and Penn Station was indeed demolished as planned, Mayor Robert Wagner in '65 signed the New York City Landmarks Law, establishing the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The commission had the power to protect designated landmarks from demolition. And that law says the Landmarks Preservation Commission protects the city's architectural, historic, and cultural resources. The commission identifies, designates, and regulates buildings, districts, sites, and interiors, surveys potential landmarks and historic districts, evaluates proposal for landmark designation, and regulates alterations to designated sites and structures. Because this was the next station that was going to come down. They didn't want to spend the money to maintain it. They had been tired, just like Penn Station, and they wanted to take it down, but the landmarks prevented it. It got renovated. I mean, it's beautiful. But Madison Square Garden was not kind to the architectural firm of McKin, Mead, and White, sort of. This was their greatest architectural commission, Penn Station. got torn down for Madison Square Garden. The firm had actually designed the second Madison Square Garden, and the designer for that was Stanford White, one of the partners. Ironically, this is the dining area that was upstairs on the outside of Madison Square Garden. He was murdered at Madison Square Garden by a jealous husband. And that was the first defense for the insanity plea, was because of this murder. But it's kind of ironic that how Madison Square Garden kind of had an effect on the firm. And that's it. Thank you.
What was the original cost of the station and the tunnel?
I don't have that number, and I've never been able to find that number, and I don't know why it was never published, or, you know, they tell you how much brick they use, they tell you how much skylights and all this, but there was never a number that said this is the total cost. And I don't know whether the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to keep that private or not, but I'm sure if I really dug into it, I could find it somewhere, but I don't know.
Last, do you know if it contained any Vermont marble or granite?
I don't believe so. They use pink marble inside, and Vermont does not have pink marble. And I don't know where the outside came from, but I haven't read anywhere where it was from Vermont. Yes.
Were there injuries or death during this building? What kind of dangerous work?
I haven't read of any. I know people got injured. They were very careful with the tunnels. It wasn't as bad as like when they were building the San Francisco Bridge, where they went down and they got the bends and everything, because here they were just on the other side. They could go, they could get air and all that, so they didn't have that kind of pressure. I'm sure there were injuries. There had to be, but I haven't read if that there were any deaths or not, especially considered the lack of safety. I mean, constructing Madison Square Garden while passengers are walking underneath you with crane, I mean, just, so. Yes? Yep.
Some of the early builders used cast iron instead of steel.
Yep.
What was used in this case?
I think it was cast iron at the time. I don't think steel had come up to that point, because
Second question really is, about the same time was the Panama Canal being built?
yes.
And they're two incredible
Yep.
things.
Yep. But this was all privately funded, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. You know, today's airports, other places of transportation are funded by the government. This was all privately funded by Pennsylvania Railroad. And they had just built Washington Union Station. And they had another station in Chicago, well, not this big, but it was, Chicago's a fairly large. I mean, they built a lot of, but they were the largest railroad. They were the standard railroad of the world, and they made money. Yeah.
Do you know if the new Preservation Commission has the authority to require maintenance on the exterior or the existing buildings?
I don't know. I don't know if you get designated as a landmark, what the strings attached are to it. I just don't know.
I think that might have helped to save this building then.
I think if it was a landmark, it wouldn't have been demolished. There was a big, when they started talking about taking this down, there was a big brouhaha, but there were no rules set in place. And a bunch of architects, a bunch of, Jackie Onassis, a bunch of people tried to save it, and they just couldn't. And at that time, the railroad was not making money. They were basically in bankruptcy, and they thought railroads weren't going to last anymore. We're not going to do passenger cars. We got to get out of this business. We can't maintain these stations. And they thought this station eventually, even the tracks would get pulled up. Right now, it's the busiest station in the country, and which is amazing that it was such capacity that even today it can handle all the trains. But now it's not a very pleasant way to arrive to New York City. I mean, you go into Grand Central, it's like, wow. I'm somewhere special, and you go out to New York City, which, you know, is one of the best cities in the world, and you go into Penn Station, and you're confused. You just can't find the tracks. You got to look for them, and people are just running around. It's like rats in a maze. I mean, it really is. And you arrive in New York City, and you go, where am I? I'm in a subway, you know, just so. But I'm a little biased, being an architect. Anything else? Thank you very much for coming.